Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirala Greenwald. This is a Sicho from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Zayin, Parshas Emor, Sicha Aleph. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learn the Rashi on the words Sheishis Yamim that speak about the mitzvah of Shabbos. And there are 5 parts on the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 2 questions on Rashi. Number 2, reject answers for each of these questions. Number 3, present the key, which is what is and what is not bothering Rashi. Number 4, based on this, answer both questions on Rashi. And number 5, present the Yenishal Torah in Rashi. We already discussed many times the utmost preciseness, the utmost precision of the teachings of Rashi on the Torah. And this is not just true in regards to the words in the teachings of Rashi, but rather also in regards to the words that Rashi quotes from the Pasuk. Those are also very precise. According to this, we have to understand, in the beginning of the Parshas HaMayadis, where the Torah teaches us in our Parsha about the Yom Tevim, so after the introduction of where it says, Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer, Daber el Bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleihim, Mayadei Hashem, asher tikru oisem mikrei kodesh, elehim mayadei, that Hashem instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to teach the Yidden about the Yom Tevim. So then the Pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim te'as hamalacha, for 6 days work should be done. Uveim ashvi Shabbat Shabbos in Mikra Kodesh, the 7th day is Shabbat Shabbos in Mikra Kodesh. Kol malacha leisasu, no work should be done. You shouldn't do any work on this day of Shabbos. And then the Torah continues, Elam mayadei Hashem. These are the Yom Tevim, and it details all the Mayadim, all the Yom Tevim. So Rashi quotes the words Sheishes Yomim. It says in the pasuk Sheishes Yomim Tiasem Alecha. So Rashi quotes the words Sheishes Yomim, and he explains Ma inyan Shabbos Eitzel Mayades. Why is Shabbos over here? What's the connection between Shabbos and the Yom Tevim? The Torah begins that Hashem instructed Moshe to teach the Yidden about the Yom Tevim, and then it speaks about Shabbos, and only afterwards goes to the Yom Tevim. Why does Shabbos get inserted over here? What's the connection? And Rashi answers, it's to teach you that anyone who is machal the Yom Tevim, the Torah considers it as if they were machal Shabbos, and whoever keeps and fulfills the Yom Tevim, the Torah considers it as if they kept and fulfilled Shabbos. And so the question over here is that it's not understood. The difficulty is, in the words of Rashi, Rashi asks, Ma inyan Shabbos etzel Moedes. So the question is, in the pasuk, the difficulty in the pasuk, as Rashi says, is what's the connection between Shabbos and the Moedes? If so Rashi should have quoted the words Uvayim Shvi Shabbos, because that's what he's coming to explain. Why is Shabbos being taught here, and not the words Sheishes Yamim? The question is about Shabbos, not about Sheishes Yamim. And instead, Rashi quotes the words Sheishes Yamim and not Uvayim Shvi Shabbos, and he doesn't even hint to the later words by writing V'Gomer. Completely ignores them. His whole teaching is on the words Sheishes Yamim, not on Uvayim Shvi Shabbos. And it's exclusively and solely on Sheishes Yamim. He doesn't even hint to the rest of the pasuk that speaks about Shabbos by writing V'Gomer. So why is this? Why is Rashi writing his teaching on the words Sheishes Yamim? Now, l'chayr, we could explain that when Rashi quotes the words Sheishes Yamim, so his intention is not just these 2 words. He's not giving a teaching on the word Sheishes Yamim, but rather he's using these 2 words as the start of the whole pasuk. So Rashi says Sheishes Yamim. He's going to be explaining this entire pasuk that starts with these 2 words, but it doesn't mean to say that he's explaining these 2 words alone. And as we indeed find that Rashi does this elsewhere, in Parshas Tetzaver, where it says Va'asu as Ephod, Rashi gives an explanation on everything that's written about the Ephod, but the header, the words that he quotes from the pasuk, are just Va'asu as Ephod, because he says Va'asu as Ephod. These are the title, the header words about the entire Parsha that discusses and teaches about the Ephod, and Rashi now teaches everything that he wants to tell us about the Ephod. And so too in the next pasuk in our Parsha, where it says Elam Moedei Hashem, and Rashi gives an explanation on the whole pasuk. He's just quoting these 3 words as the header, the title of the whole pasuk, and his explanations on the whole pasuk. But these are just the words that represent the whole pasuk, and he does it in those places without adding V'Gomer. So too here we can say Rashi is giving his teaching on the whole pasuk that talks about Shabbos, and he quotes the start words of the pasuk to indicate that his teaching is on this whole pasuk. And so with Sheishes Yamim, even without V'Gomer, he means to say, I'm saying a teaching now in the pasuk that starts with the words Sheishes Yamim. However, we can answer this over here, because Rashi only quotes the starting words of an inyan, when those starting words contain in them the basic idea of the whole inyan. Like in the above examples, Rashi quotes the words va'asu es ha'ephod, which say, and they should make the ephod. So now he can tell us everything about the ephod. Rashi doesn't just quote the word va'asu. He quotes va'asu es ha'ephod, which those three words capture in them the whole idea of the ephod. So too in the Rashi in our parsha, after this Rashi, where Rashi quotes the words Eila Mayad Hashem, he doesn't just say Eila. He says Eila Mayad Hashem, that these three words capture the whole idea of the pasuk. However, here in our pasuk, Rashi is explaining, as he says, Ma inyan Shabbos. Why is Shabbos being taught here? And the starting words of Sheshis Yomim don't contain the inyan of Shabbos at all. Sheshis Yomim doesn't say anything about Shabbos. And so the question remains, if Rashi's teaching is, as he says, to explain why is Shabbos being written here, so then why is he saying his teaching on the words Sheshis Yomim? Another question on the lashon, on the wording, on the language of Rashi is, why does Rashi begin with the negative of Shekol HaMechalel HaSamayades and not the positive of Shekol HaMekayim HaSamayades? In the logical way of presenting something, you would say whoever fulfills this, it's like they fulfill that, and whoever desecrates this, it's like they desecrated that. You start with the positive and then you move on to the negative. And this is especially since the pasuk speaks in the positive. The Torah over here speaks about fulfilling and keeping Shabbos. So Rashi should first say it's compared in the sense that whoever keeps and fulfills Shabbos is like they're keeping and fulfilling Yom Tov, and whoever desecrates Shabbos, it's as if they're desecrating Yom Tov. So why does Rashi present it in the negative and then the positive? Logically, positive should come before negative, and also in terms of fitting with the pasuk. And even though Rashi takes this teaching from the Medrash in the Teres Kahanim, where it's taught this way, first the negative and then the positive, so since it's the source, you'd say that's where Rashi presents it this way as well. However, in addition to the fact that the Teres Kahanim teaches it on the pasuk in general and not on the specifics and the wording as Rashi does, Rashi quotes the words Sheshis Yomim, but in addition to that, it's known that Rashi presents teachings from a drushim in such a way that they relate to and that they are in the style of Pshuta Shemikra. And so Rashi will make such changes. So why doesn't he do that over here? So L'chayr can answer this question that the intent of the pasuk over here in comparing Yom Tov to Shabbos, why is the pasuk even comparing them? It's mainly to caution against thinking that it's okay to be lenient about doing malacha on Yom Tov, because the whole establishment of Yom Tov, and as a result, the Isser of malacha on Yom Tov depends on Bezdin. Yom Tov is established by Bezdin, based on when they determine Rish Chodesh is, that will determine when Yom Tov is. So the whole point over here of the pasuk comparing Yom Tov to Shabbos is to caution against thinking that it's okay to be lenient about doing malacha on Yom Tov. So when we look at the wording of the pasuk, maybe it's in the positive, but the intent of the pasuk mentioning Shabbos here in the first place is to caution about the severity of malacha on Yom Tov. And so therefore the main emphasis and caution is on the kol ha-mechalel es ha-moyades, Mylin Olav Kilu Chilu es ha-Shabbasis. The whole emphasis of the pasuk, not when we look at the wording, but we look at the intention of the pasuk, is the caution about being mechalal Yom Tov, against desecrating Yom Tov. And so therefore, when Rashi says his teaching on this pasuk, he begins with the main point of the pasuk, which is the severity of being mechalal Yom Tov. And only afterwards he mentions the continuation of the teaching that also compares them in terms of keeping and fulfilling Yom Tov. However, this answer is not enough, because since the pasuk makes the comparison in the positive, even though the intent is to caution against desecrating, being machal Yom Tov, but since the pasuk actually makes the comparison in the positive, and it's through that that we also learn about the negative, so therefore Rashi, in explaining the pasuk, Rashi is explaining the pasuk, so he has to follow the lead of the pasuk. So he should also only mention the positive, or at the very least, start with the positive. So even though the intent may be the negative, but since the pasuk teaches it in the positive, and it's through the positive that we come to the negative, so Rashi, who's explaining the pasuk, should teach it in that way, focus on the positive, either exclusively the positive, or at the very least start with the positive. Now we're going to move straight into answering the questions, and we're going to begin with the main point of the answer. The main point of the answer, which is the key to understanding this whole Rashi, is to understand what is and what isn't bothering Rashi here. We're going to see that what we thought is bothering Rashi is not bothering Rashi, and it's actually something different which is bothering Rashi. So that's the main point over here, is just to focus on what is and what isn't bothering Rashi. And in the process, we're also going to partially answer question number one about why does Rashi quote the words Sheshis Yomim and not Uvayim Hashvi Shabbos. So the explanation in this is as follows. The question of Ma Inyan Shabbos Eitzel HaMoedes on its own is actually not a big question in Pshuto Shemikra. It's not such a question why is Shabbos being mentioned here, since as a number of Mefarshei HaTorah indeed answer, also Shabbos is included in Eila Moed Hashem, since it can be called a Yom Moed, being that it's Asar B'Melacha. So it's not really a great difficulty that Shabbos is inserted over here. And even if we say that Shabbos cannot be included in Eila Moed Hashem Asher Tikru, that you're making, since Shabbos is not made by Bezdin, it happens automatically on its own. But we can still learn that the pasuk mentions Shabbos as a side point in order to point out that the differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. There are two differences. Number one, Shabbos isn't dependent on Bezdin. It happens automatically every 7 days. And number two, Shabbos is also called Shabbos Shabbosin, since also Malachas Eichel Nefesh is also in it. On Yom Tov, a person can do malachas with food, and on Shabbos, even such malachas are forbidden, and that's why it's called Shabbos Shabbosin. So the question, Ma in Shabbos Eitzel HaMoedes on its own is not really such a big question in Pshuto Shemikra, and that's not what Rashi is coming to ask over here. The difficulty Rashi is addressing is the introductory words of Sheishis Yamim Te'asim Malacha. That's what's bothering Rashi. Why does the Torah start over here? If it wants to teach and mention Shabbos among the Moedei Hashem, either because it belongs there or to contrast them, it should just talk about Shabbos. Why does it start with the words Sheishis Yamim Te'asem Malacha? Now, in the first tzivah in the Torah regarding Shabbos, over there it says also Sheishis Yamim. So there it's understood why the Torah first needs to say Sheishis Yamim. Because since the Torah is teaching now for the very first time that it's also to do Malacha on Shabbos, so the Torah needs to reassure us not to worry about Parnasa, since there's nothing to worry about, since Sheishis Yom Taved V'Sichos Malachtecha, you can work for 6 days. And furthermore, besides for that point, that it makes sense to teach it over there in order to reassure a person that they could work for 6 days, number one, it fits with the continuation there that presents the reason for Shmir Shabbos, which is Ki Sheishis Yomim Asa Hashem. Hashem created the world in 6 days, and Vayanach, he rested on the 7th. So you too work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. And number two, we learn actually something from Sheishis Yomim Taved V'Sichos Malachtecha. There's a teaching there. That's why it has to be taught. We learn that Kishetave Shabbos Yeh Beinecha Kilu Kol Malachtecha Asuya. It says Sheishis Yom Taved V'Sichos Kol Malachtecha. Do all your work. It's telling us that when Shabbos comes, you should experience it and see it as if all your work is already done, and now you could have Shabbos in complete and total peace. And so the fact that it teaches it over there is not a difficulty, but over here that's what's bothering Rashi. Why is Sheishis Yom Te'asem Malacha written here? And it's this difficulty that Rashi answers by saying Ma'inyan Shabbos Eitzel Moedes L'Lamedcha Shekol HaMachal Chulu. That's the difficulty that Rashi is coming to answer. So the main thing that we did over here before we continue is to draw attention to what is the question that Rashi has here. Based on this, we'll see how all the questions are answered. And we also partially answered our first question. Now we understand why Rashi quotes the word Sheishis Yomim and not Uvayim Shvi Shabbos, because the difficulty is on the word Sheishis Yomim. We still have to understand why does Rashi quote specifically Sheishis Yomim and not Sheishis Yomim Taved. But we partially answered the question. Now let's continuing back with where we left off. Rashi over here says, "Ma'inin Shabbos Eitzel HaMoedes L'Lamedcha Shekol HaMachal V'Chulu," etc. He's explaining that the pasuk wants to compare the severity of doing malacha on the Moedes to the severity of doing malacha on Shabbos. And based on this, it's understood why the Torah starts with the introduction of Sheishis Yomim Te'asem Malacha. It's these words, Sheishis Yomim Te'asem Malacha, that communicate to us, as we'll see, that we could compare the severity of Malacha on Yom Tov to the severity of Malacha on Shabbos. And so Rashi tells us, Sheishis Yamim. Why does it say here Sheishis Yamim? As we'll explain in the continuation, these words teach us to compare the severity of Malacha on Yom Tov to the severity of Malacha on Shabbos. So now we're going to move on to understanding this teaching of Rashi. We said Rashi says that from the words Sheishis Yamim, we learn to compare the severity of doing Malacha on Yom Tov to the severity of doing Malacha on Shabbos. How do we learn it from the words Sheishis Yamim? And then after we explain this, we'll move on to answering the first question in its entirety and also the second question. So the explanation of this teaching is as follows. Sheishis Yamim doesn't only indicate a total of 6 individual days, but rather it also means an entity of 6 days. Sheishis Yamim is one group, one entity of 6 days. As Rashi teaches a few psukim later, and also he teaches it earlier in Sefer Shmos a couple of times, that Kol Makim Shenemar Shivas Shem Davarhu. Whenever it says Shivas, it's not just a number. It's actually an entity of Shavua Shel Yamim, a week of days. It's a week. It's not talking about just the number 7. It's an entity, like a week is an entity. V'chein kol lashon shmoinas, sheishes, chameshes, shloishes. They're all an entity besides just being a quantity of days. And this is what Sheishes Yamim Tiyasa Malacha means. Hashem gave a distinct entity of Sheishes Yamim that only then is a person allowed to do Malacha. So this means that any time that's not included in the mundane Sheishes Yamim, they are Asur b'Malacha and all equally. So according to this, it's understood why the Torah prefaces the start of the Parshas Amerdis with saying Sheishes Yamim Tiyasa Malacha. With this, the Torah defines two general categories and types of time in regards to doing malacha. One is the time of Sheishes Yamim. That's a time which is mutter, it's permitted for a person to do malacha. And then there are all other times. They're not in the Sheishes Yamim, and they are all equally asur b'malacha. And according to this, it's understood how we learn from this that kol ha'machalel es hamaydes ma'ilin olav kilu chilo l'shashabasis, and v'chol ha'makayim es hamaydes is ma'ilin olav kilu kimas hashabasis. Even though regarding the punishment of Isser Malacha on Yom Tov, it isn't the same as the punishment for Isser Malacha on Shabbos. But nevertheless, the Isser Malacha, the actual Isser, not the punishment, the Isser Malacha of Yom Tov is in the same category as the Isser Malacha of Shabbos. It's a time which is outside of the mundane Sheishes Yamim. And the Torah tells us there are two categories of time. The Sheishes Yamim are mutter, and all other times are equally Asr. So now we understand what was troubling Rashi. It's the introductory words of Sheishes Yamim, and we understand his teaching and how he takes this teaching from those words. That Sheishes Yamim is telling us there is a defined and distinct time of 6 days of Chayil, and they're the only times that are mutter and malacha. All others are in the second category of time, which is Asr and malacha, and they're all equally in that category. And so we could compare the severity of doing malacha on Yom Tov to the severity of doing malacha on Shabbos. And in the next section, we'll see how all of this will explain and answer to us the two questions that we had on Rashi. Now that we understand what isn't and what is bothering Rashi in the pasuk, and how Rashi answers the question in the pasuk, we can move on to directly and fully answering question number 1 and also answering question number 2. So according to this, it's understood why Rashi only quotes the words Sheishes Yamim, and he doesn't even add V'Gomer, because with this Rashi emphasizes that Sheishes Yamim is a distinct entity and category of time for itself, and that the continuation in the pasuk of Vayem Shvi is not a continuation to the Sheishes Yamim. We shouldn't read it in the context of you can't do Malacha on Shabbos, so the Torah tells us the 6 days you could do Malacha, on the 7th day you can't. No. The Torah is telling us Sheishes Yamim is a distinct entity, and so the continuation, when it talks about Shabbos, Shabbos is a separate category of time, which is Asr b'Malacha. And therefore, once it's telling us that there are two entities of time, so we can learn that Kol HaMachalel by Yom Tov is like the Machal Shabbos, V'chol HaMakayim by Yom Tov is like the Makayim by Shabbos. And Rashi also doesn't add the words Te'asa Malacha. Not only doesn't he write a Vayim Shvi, and he only writes Sheishes Yamim, he doesn't even add Sheishes Yamim Te'asa Malacha. So there's two explanations for this. Either since that's voluntary, the Torah is not telling us you have to do malacha, it's voluntary, and the difference between the Sheishes Yamim and Shabbos and Yom Tov on the other hand is an Isser malacha. There's two distinct entities of time, one where malacha is not Asr, and one where it is Asr. It's about Isser malacha, it's not about voluntary malacha. And the Te'asa malacha is a voluntary aspect. And we can also say that Rashi says Sheishes Yamim referring to the whole continued discussion, like we said by Va'asva Sa'ifid. He means to say Sheishes Yamim of Te'asa malacha. And according to this, we can also understand the order of first saying Kol HaMachalel in the negative and only afterwards V'chol HaMakayim in the positive. Because since we learned the general comparison of Shabbos to Yom Tov from Sheishes Yamim, that Sheishes Yamim is a distinct entity of time, where a person is not Asr and Malacha, and all other times are Asr and Malacha, so it comes out that the teaching is regarding Chilul Yom Tov. It's telling us Sheishes Yamim, there's no Isr Malacha, and otherwise, if it's not in the Sheishes Yamim, which refers to Shabbos and Yom Tov, then it is Asr in Malacha. So it's talking about the Isser of Malacha, which relates to Chilul of Yom Tov, not keeping this Isser, desecrating this Isser. So it's saying that someone who is Mechalal Yom Tov by doing Malacha, that with this they are transgressing, they're being over the categorization and limitation of the Sheishes Yamim by they're bringing basically into the time of Heter, a time that is Asr, which is outside of the Sheishes Yamim. We're talking about Shabbos, and in this case Yom Tov. So therefore, it's as if the person is Mechal Shabbos and Mechalal Lava to Shemei Ahin. from the negative, we hear the positive. That if someone who desecrates Yom Tov, it's like they're desecrating Shabbos. So we also learn that v'chol ha'makayim amayadis ma'alin olav kilu kimis hashabbasis. And with that, we answered both questions. So the key was understanding what in the pasuk is bothering Rashi. Besides for what's not bothering Rashi, what is bothering Rashi, and how he answers it. Based on that, we can understand which words Rashi quotes on the pasuk, and how he presents the teaching in the negative, and only afterwards the positive. From the initial Torah in this Rashi, it's known that Chazal say on Sheishas Yom Taved, they say Zu mitzvah aseh. This is a mitzvah aseh. This means that doing malacha during the 6 weeks days is not just mutter according to Torah, but rather it's a mitzvah, and it's a derech, it's a path in the Avodas Hashem of Yid. And as it's known that there must first be the introduction, it says of Hashem Lekecha B'chol Asher Ta'asa. So there must first be the introduction of B'chol Asher Ta'asa, and afterwards comes the U'v'yiracha Hashem Lekecha. However, on the other hand, this approach and path, this derech, is only necessary because of the physical body of a Yid. That because of the Helen V'Hester of the body, so according to Torah, a Yid must conduct oneself according to the ways of Teva. And this is similar to the saying of Chazal that Ein Soimcha Al Nes, you can't rely on a miracle, and Dina D'Malchus Dina. It's because of the Helen Behester of the body that we say there has to be the Tasa, the Malacha of a Yid. However, from the perspective of the Neshama of a Yid, so not only isn't it necessary to do Malacha, but on the contrary, there should be no Malacha at all. Because since the Neshama isn't confined to the body and its nature, and the Neshama wasn't placed in Galus, but rather the Neshama is entirely above the Helen Behester of the world, and on that level, doing malacha is similar to what it says, Man someone who gestures in front of the king is chayiv misa. The neshama is standing right in front of the king. There's no Helen V'Hester. It's always right in front of the Eibishter. And so over there shouldn't be any malacha whatsoever. And this is similar to if someone is mispal kol hayom kulei. It says halavai that a person should be mispal kol hayom kulei. Halavai a person should be mispal Shemoneh Esrei the whole day. That in Shemoneh Esrei a person is forbidden to do malacha, and even machvi, even to gesture the entire time, the entire day, if someone is being mispal kol hayom. And therefore, from the perspective of the neshama, a state of tishbais, of not doing any malacha is required. And these are the two extremes that are demanded of a Yid. During the Sheishas Yamim, when a Yid is al pi Torah occupied with their bodily needs, so then Tavid is a mitzvah aseh. However, on the days of Shabbos and Yom Tov, when the air, the light of the neshama is shining by a Yid, so then one must rise and stand above their bodily matters and above their nature. And therefore, it's understood that doing malacha at such a time is inconceivable. And since the neshama is above the body, and it's above Golus, so therefore eventually it prevails over the body. That notwithstanding that the body exists in limits and in Golus, the power, the toikif, the potency of the neshama, which is above limitations in Golus, will shine until the neshama will actually free the body from Golus kipshuta in the Gula Mitzvah Shlema through Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Kartiv Mamash.